Captain Rodriguez's face went white when he saw me at the family barbecue. His hands snapped to attention, and he said the words that made my entire family freeze. "Ma'am." "Commander Chen? Special Operations." In that moment, they realized the daughter they'd called worthless had been commanding the most elite military units in the world. They brought out the good china. My mother set the table with military precision. My father cleared his throat like he was about to deliver a eulogy. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed. Because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. But I knew exactly what this was. A ceremony to bury the last shred of respect they pretended to have for me. That Sunday afternoon, with my brother Marcus sitting like a golden prince at the head of our dining room table, they made their announcement. "Rebecca, it's time you stopped this foolishness and found a real job. Maybe retail or reception work. Something suitable." My mother nodded as if she was discussing the weather. My father smiled like he'd just solved world hunger. I sat there in my civilian clothes, listening to them plan my surrender, and I almost laughed. Almost. Because what they didn't know, what they'd never bothered to ask in the 8 months since I'd been home, was who I really was. I'm Rebecca Chen. I'm 28 years old. And my family spent 2 decades telling me I was nothing, while I became everything they never imagined possible. For as long as I can remember, success in the Chen household was measured by one standard: Marcus. My older brother, the Marine Corps infantry soldier, the family's shining star, their proof that our bloodline produced warriors. When Marcus graduated boot camp, they threw a party. When he got promoted to sergeant, they framed his picture. When he came home on leave, the whole neighborhood knew about it. Me? I was the disappointment. The daughter who, quote, couldn't even finish college properly, according to my father. The one who, quote, wasted her potential, according to my mother. The girl who'd vanished for 4 years and came back different, quieter, more reserved, carrying herself like she knew secrets they couldn't fathom. They assumed I'd dropped out, maybe joined some minimum wage job, probably embarrassed the family name somewhere far from home. When I returned to our small town in Colorado, they didn't ask questions. They didn't want to know. They just saw their failed daughter, back to live in their basement like some cautionary tale. The truth was simpler and more complicated than they could imagine. While Marcus was learning to march in formation, I was learning to disappear. While he was practicing rifle drills, I was mastering 15 different languages. While he was following orders, I was giving them to teams that didn't officially exist. My family lived in a world where respect was earned through visible achievement, medals you could frame, ranks you could announce, stories you could tell at dinner parties. They worshipped the conventional military hero, the brave soldier charging into battle, the decorated veteran with a chest full of ribbons, the warrior whose valor could be measured and displayed. What they never understood was that some of us fought wars they'd never hear about. Some of us bled for victories that would never make the news. Some of us carried secrets so classified that our own families couldn't know we existed. I grew up watching Marcus get praised for every small accomplishment, while my achievements were dismissed as, quote, not real work. When I graduated high school early at 16, they said I was trying too hard. When I got accepted into MIT, they worried I was too ambitious for a girl. When I told them I was joining the military, my father laughed and said, "The Army needs clerks too, I suppose." They never asked which branch I'd joined. They never asked about my training. They never asked why I couldn't tell them where I was stationed or what I was doing. They simply assumed their disappointment of a daughter had found her level somewhere in the depths of military bureaucracy. For 8 years, I let them believe their comfortable lie. It was easier than explaining that some truths are too dangerous for family dinner conversations. The conversation that changed everything happened on a Tuesday morning, over burnt coffee and yesterday's newspaper. I was sitting at the kitchen table, scrolling through job listings on my laptop, not because I needed work, but because I needed my family to believe I was looking for work. My disability checks were more than enough to cover my expenses, but explaining military disability payments would have required explanations I couldn't give. My mother walked in, wearing her disappointed expression like a carefully pressed uniform. She poured herself coffee, added exactly 2 sugars the way she had for 30 years, and sat down across from me with the weight of unspoken judgment. "Rebecca," she began, using the tone she reserved for discussing my failures, "your father and I have been talking. I knew what was coming. I'd seen the signs for weeks. The way they whispered when I entered rooms. The concerned glances they exchanged when they thought I wasn't looking. The careful way they avoided asking direct questions about my future. We're worried about you," she continued, stirring her coffee with mechanical precision. "You've been home for 8 months now, and you're not progressing. You sleep until noon, you barely leave the house, and this job search doesn't seem to be going anywhere." The irony was suffocating. I slept until noon because my body was still adjusting to civilian time zones after years of operating in places where night and day meant the difference between mission success and catastrophic failure. I barely left the house because crowds still made my hand drift toward weapons that weren't there. The job search wasn't going anywhere because I was technically still on active duty, just on extended medical leave that I couldn't explain without violating about 17 different security clearances. "We think," my father's voice joined from the doorway, "that you need structure, purpose, something to give your life meaning again." Again. As if my life had ever lacked meaning in their eyes. "Marcus is doing so well," my mother added, because every conversation about my failures inevitably became a celebration of my brother's successes. "He's been promoted again. Staff sergeant now. His commanding officer says he might make it to the sergeant major track if he keeps this up." I nodded and made appropriate sounds of admiration. Marcus was a good soldier. Disciplined, reliable. Exactly the kind of Marine the Corps built its reputation on. What he wasn't was special operations material. He'd tried for Force Recon twice and been passed over both times. Not because he wasn't good enough for the regular Marines, but because elite units required something different. Something that couldn't be taught or earned through conventional dedication. "The point is," my father continued, settling into his chair with the authority of a man who'd never been contradicted, "Marcus has found his place. He's building something, contributing, making us proud." The unspoken accusation hung in the air like smoke. "And you're not, so we've made a decision," my mother announced, and I felt the trap closing around me. "Either you find meaningful employment in the next 60 days, or you find somewhere else to live. We won't enable this drifting any longer." I looked at my parents, really looked at them, and saw 2 people who had convinced themselves they were saving me. They had no idea they were about to destroy the careful cover that had kept me alive for the past 8 months. They didn't know that my drifting was actually a medically necessary decompression period after 8 years of operations so classified that my own therapist didn't have clearance to hear the details. They thought they were motivating their lazy daughter to get her life together. What they were actually doing was forcing me to choose between maintaining my cover and keeping my family. "Whatso Kia?" I closed my laptop and looked at them both. 60 days? 60 days, my father confirmed. "A real job, Rebecca. Not some part-time thing. Something with a future. Something we can be proud of when people ask what our daughter does for a living." That night, I sat in my basement bedroom staring at the phone number I'd memorized but hoped never to use. My handler had given it to me on my last day of active duty, along with very specific instructions. "Only call this number if your cover is blown or if you're in immediate danger. Otherwise, you're a ghost until we say you're not." My cover wasn't blown. I wasn't in immediate danger. I was just a daughter whose family was about to make the biggest mistake of their lives. The first crack in my carefully constructed civilian facade came 3 weeks into my parents' ultimatum. When Marcus brought home Captain James Rodriguez for Sunday dinner, I was in the kitchen helping my mother prepare her famous pot roast. The same meal she'd served every Sunday for as long as I could remember, when I heard Marcus's voice echoing through the front door. "Mom, Dad, I brought someone I want you to meet. This is Captain Rodriguez, my new company commander." I froze with a wooden spoon halfway to my mouth, tasting the gravy my mother had asked me to sample. Rodriguez. The name hit me like a physical blow, sending my mind racing through classified briefings and midnight extraction reports. It couldn't be the same Rodriguez. The odds were astronomical. But when I walked into the living room carrying the serving dish, my worst fears were confirmed. Captain James Rodriguez, United States Marine Corps, stood in my parents' modest living room. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Wearing his dress blues and a smile that died the moment our eyes met. I had last seen Captain Rodriguez 3 years ago in a bombed-out building in Afghanistan, where he'd been a lieutenant coordinating ground support for an operation I couldn't discuss. An operation where I'd been the ranking officer in a room full of men who thought I was just another intelligence analyst. For exactly 2.3 seconds, we stared at each other in mutual recognition. Then his military training kicked in, and he looked away, focusing his attention entirely on my parents as if I'd suddenly become invisible. But I'd caught the flash of something in his eyes. Confusion, followed by a kind of professional alarm that made my stomach clench. He knew who I was. More importantly, he knew what I was. And he was wondering what the hell Commander Rebecca Chen, Special Operations, was doing serving pot roast in a suburban Colorado dining room. "Rebecca, don't just stand there," my mother chided. "Put the roast on the table and come meet Captain Rodriguez properly." I set down the serving dish with hands that were perfectly steady despite the adrenaline flooding my system. Years of training had taught me to control my physical responses even when my mind was screaming warnings. "Captain," I said, extending my hand in what I hoped looked like a normal civilian greeting. "Ma'am," he replied, and I caught the slight hesitation before he decided to treat me like any other family member. His handshake was firm but brief, and he avoided direct eye contact. During dinner, I watched Rodriguez struggle with what he knew versus what he was seeing. My parents regaled him with stories of Marcus's military achievements, while pointedly avoiding any mention of my gap years. Marcus basked in the attention, describing his latest training exercises and upcoming deployment rotations. "What about your daughter?" Rodriguez finally asked, and I felt the temperature in the room shift. "Is she in the service as well?" The silence that followed was thick with embarrassment. My father cleared his throat. My mother suddenly became very interested in cutting her meat. Marcus looked uncomfortable. "Rebecca tried the military for a while," my father finally said, using the tone people reserve for discussing someone's brief bout with alcoholism. "It didn't really work out. She's between opportunities right now." I watched Rodriguez's face carefully. The confusion deepened, followed by something that looked almost like anger. He glanced at me, then back at my parents, and I could practically see him trying to reconcile what he knew about my classified service record with what my family was telling him. "Between opportunities," he repeated slowly. "We're hopeful she'll find something suitable soon," my mother added quickly. "Something more traditional. Rebecca's always been a bit too independent for her own good." That's when I saw it. The moment Rodriguez realized that my family had absolutely no idea who I was or what I'd done for my country. The moment he understood that the woman they were describing as a failure had once held the kind of security clearance that could topple governments. The text message arrived at 0347 hours the morning after the disastrous dinner with Captain Rodriguez. My phone buzzed once on the nightstand, pulling me from the kind of light sleep that had become my normal since returning stateside. "Need to talk. Coffee shop on Elm Street. 0800. Come alone. Dodge Jr." I stared at the message for a full minute before deleting it. Rodriguez was taking a massive risk by contacting me directly. Any communication between us outside official channels could trigger security reviews that would destroy both our careers. But he'd reached out anyway, which meant something was seriously wrong. I arrived at the coffee shop 15 minutes early, ordered black coffee, and positioned myself at a corner table with clear sightlines to all entrances. Old habits die hard, and some habits keep you alive. Rodriguez walked in at exactly 0800, wearing civilian clothes but carrying himself with the unmistakable bearing of active military. He ordered his coffee and approached my table with the kind of measured casualness that screamed surveillance awareness. "Commander," he said quietly as he sat down, using my rank for the first time since that awkward dinner. "Rebecca is fine," I replied. "I'm on extended leave." "Are you?" He studied my face with the intensity of someone trying to solve a puzzle. "Because your family seems to think you've been discharged. They talk about you like you washed out of basic training." I took a sip of coffee that tasted like disappointment and stale water. "My family doesn't have clearance for the truth." Jesus Christ. Rodriguez leaned back in his chair, running a hand through his hair. Do you have any idea what this looks like from the outside? Your brother talks about you like you're some kind of family embarrassment. Your parents are planning an intervention to get you to find a job at Target or something. I know exactly how it looks. Then why are you letting them think? He stopped himself, glancing around the nearly empty coffee shop. This is insane. You led the operation that saved my entire platoon in Kandahar. You've got more combat decorations than most colonels. And your family thinks you're a failure? The truth was more complicated than Rodriguez could understand. My medical leave wasn't just about physical injuries. It was about psychological decompression after 8 years of operations that had required me to become someone else entirely. The military psychologist had been very clear. I needed to rediscover who Rebecca Chen was when she wasn't Commander Chen. Living with my family, pretending to be their disappointment of a daughter, had seemed like the perfect cover for that process. What I hadn't anticipated was how deeply their dismissal would cut. How their casual cruelty would reopen wounds I thought had healed. How their complete inability to see my worth would make me question everything I'd sacrificed for my country. It's complicated, I said finally. Complicated? Rodriguez's voice carried the edge of barely controlled anger. Commander, yesterday I watched your mother apologize to me for your lack of direction in life. She actually apologized. For you. The woman who spent 3 months coordinating counterterrorism operations across 4 countries, while everyone thought she was just an intelligence analyst. I felt something cold settle in my chest. You can't tell them. I'm not going to tell them. That's not my place, and I don't have clearance for half of what you've done anyway. But this... He gestured vaguely toward the direction of my parents' house. This is wrong, and it's making your brother impossible to work with. What do you mean? Rodriguez sighed. Marcus has been acting strange since that dinner. Asking weird questions about military intelligence, about special operations, about whether I've ever worked with female officers in combat roles. He keeps bringing up stories about you, things from when you were kids that don't match the failure narrative your parents are pushing. My blood went cold. What kind of stories? How you used to solve puzzles that stumped adults. How you learned languages by watching foreign movies. How you could track animals through the woods when you were 10 years old. Rodriguez met my eyes. Your brother isn't stupid, Commander. He's starting to figure out that the sister he remembers doesn't match the sister your parents are describing. I closed my eyes, feeling the careful walls I'd built around my civilian life beginning to crumble. Marcus can't know. No one can know. Then you need to make a choice, Rodriguez said quietly. Because this situation is becoming unsustainable. And sooner or later, someone's going to ask the right questions. The decision crystallized 3 days later when I found my father in the garage, talking to our neighbor Mr. Peterson about my situation. We just don't know what to do with her anymore, my father was saying as he organized his tool bench with the same methodical precision he brought to every task. 8 months she's been home, and nothing. No job, no direction, no ambition. It's like the military broke something in her. Peterson, a Vietnam veteran who'd always treated me with quiet respect, shifted uncomfortably. Maybe she just needs time, Bill. Coming back isn't always easy. Time? My father laughed, but there was no humor in it. Jim, she was barely in the service for 4 years. It's not like she saw combat or anything serious. Probably spent the whole time filing paperwork in some air-conditioned office. Marcus has been deployed 3 times to active combat zones, and he's fine. I stood frozen in the doorway, listening to my father casually dismiss 8 years of my life. 8 years that included operations he'd never be cleared to know about, sacrifices he couldn't begin to understand, and wounds that would never fully heal. That night, I made the call. Rebecca? The voice on the other end belonged to Colonel Sarah Martinez, my former commanding officer and the closest thing to a mentor I'd ever had. I wasn't expecting to hear from you for another 6 months. How's the decompression going? I need advice, Colonel. Sarah, you're on leave, remember? What's going on? I told her everything. The ultimatum, Rodriguez's visit, Marcus's growing suspicions, my parents' complete dismissal of my service. When I finished, the silence stretched long enough that I wondered if the call had dropped. Rebecca, Sarah finally said, her voice carrying the weight of 30 years in the military. "Are you telling me that your family thinks you're a failure?" "Yes, ma'am." "And you've been letting them think that for 8 months?" It seemed easier than explaining. Easier for who? The sharpness in her voice cut through my excuses. "Rebecca, I've watched you plan operations that saved hundreds of lives. I've seen you make decisions under pressure that generals twice your age couldn't handle. And you're telling me you can't figure out how to tell your parents that you're a decorated war hero?" The truth was that I'd gotten comfortable in their disappointment. It was simpler than living up to expectations I could never explain. Easier than watching them struggle to reconcile the daughter they knew with the soldier I'd become. "What do you recommend?" "Controlled disclosure," Sarah said without hesitation. "You don't need to violate security protocols to establish your credibility. Your service record has enough unclassified elements to prove your worth without compromising operational security." She was right. My basic service record, rank, deployments, general commendations, was all public information. I'd been so focused on protecting classified details that I'd forgotten there was a middle ground. "There's something else," Sarah continued. "I've been monitoring some chatter about your situation. Rodriguez filed a report about potential security concerns involving a family member of active military personnel. Nothing serious, but it's created a paper trail." My stomach dropped. "What kind of security concerns?" "Questions about whether your cover story is sustainable long-term. Whether family pressure might compromise your psychological recovery. Whether continued deception might create vulnerabilities that could be exploited by hostile actors." The implications hit me like cold water. If my situation was being viewed as a potential security risk, my medical leave could be terminated early. I could be recalled to active duty before I was ready, or worse, cleared for discharge to eliminate the complication. "I need to fix this," I said. "Yes, you do. And Rebecca?" "The 4th of July is next week. Marcus mentioned to Rodriguez that your family is planning a barbecue. Lots of neighbors, lots of Marines from the local base. Sounds like the perfect opportunity for some strategic revelation." I closed my eyes, already seeing how it could work. A casual encounter with fellow service members. The right questions asked at the right moment. Truth revealed in a context that would be impossible to deny or dismiss. "Colonel, Sarah, thank you. Don't thank me yet. Thank me after you've reclaimed your life." The week leading up to the 4th of July barbecue became the most carefully orchestrated operation I'd planned since leaving active duty. Every detail had to be perfect, every variable accounted for, every possible outcome prepared for. Rodriguez became my unwitting ally in the preparation. During his regular visits to see Marcus, he began dropping subtle hints about military protocol and the respect due to certain ranks. Nothing obvious, just casual comments about how he'd learned to recognize different service branches by their bearing, or stories about working with some truly exceptional officers during joint operations. "You know," he told Marcus during one of their training discussions, "the most impressive commanding officers I've served under weren't always the ones you'd expect. Some of the best tactical minds I've encountered were people who looked like they couldn't hurt a fly." I watched Marcus absorb these comments, saw the wheels turning in his head as he tried to reconcile what Rodriguez was saying with what our parents had taught him about military leadership. My mother, meanwhile, was in full hostess preparation mode, determined to show off her son's military connections to the entire neighborhood. She'd invited half the town, including several families with military backgrounds and 3 Marines from Marcus's unit. The guest list read like a perfect audience for the revelation I was planning. 2 days before the barbecue, I made a crucial decision. I called Master Sergeant Elena Vasquez, a Marine I'd worked with during a joint operation in Syria. Vasquez didn't know the classified details of what I'd done, but she knew enough about my rank and reputation to serve as credible backup if things went sideways. "Rebecca?" Her voice carried the warmth of shared combat experience. "Girl, what are you doing calling me? Aren't you supposed to be on some kind of sabbatical?" "I need a favor, Elena. A big one." I explained the situation, carefully staying within the bounds of what she was cleared to know. When I finished, her laughter echoed through the phone. "Let me get this straight. Your family thinks you're a washout, and you want me to accidentally show up at their barbecue and accidentally let slip that you're one of the most decorated officers I've ever served with?" "Something like that." Honey, I've been waiting 3 years for an excuse to tell someone what a badass you are. Consider it done. The night before the barbecue, I went through my old military footlocker, something I'd avoided doing since coming home. Buried beneath civilian clothes and medical paperwork, I found what I was looking for. My dress uniform, cleaned and pressed, with all the ribbons and decorations I'd earned but never displayed. I didn't plan to wear it, but having it ready felt like putting on armor for a different kind of battle. Marcus found me that night, sitting on my bed and staring at the uniform laid out beside me. "Hey," he said quietly, hovering in the doorway. "You okay?" I looked at my brother, really looked at him. At 26, he carried himself with the confidence of someone who'd found his place in the world. But there was something else in his eyes now, a uncertainty that hadn't been there before Rodriguez started visiting. "Marcus," I said carefully, "what do you remember about me before I left for the military?" He leaned against the doorframe, thinking. "You were always different. Smarter than the rest of us. Dad used to get frustrated because you'd solve problems in ways he couldn't follow. Mom worried you were too intense, too focused. And now?" "Now?" He was quiet for a long moment. "Now I'm wondering if maybe we never really knew you at all." The opening was there, perfect and inviting. I could have told him everything in that moment, prepared him for what was coming. But something held me back. Maybe it was the desire to see his genuine reaction. Or maybe it was 8 years of operational security training that made partial disclosure feel more dangerous than complete revelation. "You'll understand tomorrow," I said instead. Marcus nodded slowly, as if he'd expected that answer. "Rodriguez keeps looking at you like he's seen a ghost." "Tomorrow," I repeated. After he left, I carefully folded the uniform and put it away. Tomorrow, I wouldn't need ribbons and decorations to prove who I was. Tomorrow, the truth would speak for itself. The 4th of July barbecue started exactly as my mother had planned. Perfect weather, perfectly grilled burgers, and perfectly awkward small talk about my continued unemployment. I spent the first hour playing the role they expected, the quiet disappointment, helping serve food while Marcus held court with his Marine buddies. Mrs. Henderson from next door cornered my mother by the potato salad. "Any luck with Rebecca's job search, Linda?" "We're hopeful," my mother replied with the forced optimism of someone discussing a terminal diagnosis. "She had an interview at the department store last week. Nothing too demanding, but it would be a start." I watched my father nod along, adding, "Sometimes you have to adjust your expectations. Not everyone can be like Marcus." The Marines from his unit were gathered around the grill, trading deployment stories and comparing training experiences. Rodriguez stood slightly apart from the group, checking his watch with the subtle tension of someone waiting for a signal. At exactly 1,500 hours, 3 p.m. to the civilians, Master Sergeant Elena Vasquez walked around the corner of our house wearing civilian clothes and carrying a bottle of wine. "Excuse me," she called out with the confident voice of someone accustomed to being heard. "I'm looking for the Chen residence." My mother hurried over, ever the gracious hostess. "That's us. Are you here for the barbecue?" "Actually, I'm looking for Rebecca Chen. We served together, and I was in the area. Thought I'd surprise her." The conversations around the yard gradually quieted as people turned to watch. My father approached with curiosity, extending his hand to Elena. "I'm Bill Chen, Rebecca's father. I didn't know she'd kept in touch with anyone from her time in the service." Elena's eyebrows shot up. "Time in the service?" "Sir, Commander Chen is still active duty. She's on medical leave." The silence that followed was absolute. You could have heard a pin drop in a thunderstorm. "Commander?" My mother's voice cracked on the word. "Oh yes, ma'am. Your daughter is one of the most respected officers I've had the privilege to serve under." Elena's voice carried the unmistakable authority of someone stating simple facts. "Special operations. I'm just a master sergeant, but Commander Chen outranks pretty much everyone here." Rodriguez stepped forward, and I saw him make the decision that would change everything. His hand snapped to attention, and in a voice that cut through 20 conversations, he said the words that made my entire family freeze. "Ma'am, Commander Chen, Special Operations?" Every head in the yard turned toward me, Marines straightened instinctively. Neighbors stared in confusion. My parents looked like someone had just announced the laws of physics had been suspended. "Captain Rodriguez," I said quietly, my voice carrying the natural command authority I'd spent 8 months suppressing. "At ease." Marcus's beer bottle slipped from his hand, shattering on the patio. "Rebecca?" "Actually," Elena said cheerfully, seemingly oblivious to the shockwaves she'd created, "it's Commander Chen." "Sorry?" "I know rank can be confusing for civilians." My father's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. My mother gripped the serving spoon so tightly her knuckles went white. "Commander?" she whispered. The 3 Marines from Marcus's unit had gone rigid with military attention. One of them, a young corporal, took a step back and said, "Ma'am, we didn't know. We apologize for any. There's nothing to apologize for," I said, feeling something unlock in my chest. For the first time in 8 months, I let them see who I really was. "You're guests in my parents' home. Please, be comfortable." Rodriguez cleared his throat. "Commander, your family didn't know?" "My family," I said, looking directly at my parents, "never asked." The weight of that statement settled over the gathering like a physical presence. Neighbors who'd spent months pitying the Chen family's unemployed daughter suddenly understood they'd been in the presence of someone whose service they'd never be cleared to fully comprehend. My father found his voice first. "Rebecca, Commander, we had no idea." "No," I agreed. "You didn't." The barbecue didn't end. It transformed. What had been a casual neighborhood gathering became an impromptu military honors ceremony as word spread through the crowd about who I really was. Mrs. Peterson, the elderly widow whose husband had served in Korea, was the first to approach me after the initial shock wore off. She walked up with tears in her eyes and simply said, "Thank you for your service, Commander." Then she hugged me with the fierce grip of someone who understood sacrifice. The 3 Marines from Marcus's unit spent the next hour asking careful questions about special operations training, their voices carrying a reverence I hadn't heard directed toward me in 8 months. They wanted to know about selection processes, about what it took to earn that level of clearance, about whether the rumors they'd heard about female operators were true. Rodriguez fielded most of their questions, explaining what he could without violating security protocols. "Let's just say," he told them, "that if Commander Chen was leading an operation, you'd want to be on her team, not against her." My parents, meanwhile, had retreated to the kitchen, where I could see them through the window having what appeared to be a heated discussion. My mother kept gesturing toward the yard while my father shook his head repeatedly, as if trying to deny what everyone had just witnessed. Marcus found me standing alone by the fence, watching the sunset paint the mountains purple. 8 years, he said quietly. "What?" "You've been active duty for 8 years. Not 4. Dad got that wrong too, didn't he?" I nodded. "I enlisted when I turned 18, same day you graduated high school." "Jesus, Rebecca." He ran his hands through his hair. "All this time I thought. We all thought. I know what you thought. Why didn't you tell us? Why let us believe you were a failure?" The question I'd been dreading hung between us like smoke. How could I explain that their disappointment had been easier to bear than their expectations? That being their failure felt safer than being their hero? "Because," I said finally, "it was easier than watching you realize I'd been lying to you for 8 years about who I was and what I did." "But we were lying too," Marcus said, his voice thick with something that might have been shame. "We were lying when we said you didn't matter. When we acted like your life was worth less than mine." Before I could respond, my parents emerged from the house. My father walked toward us with the careful steps of someone approaching a wild animal, while my mother hung back by the door. "Rebecca," he said, and I heard him struggle with whether to use my name or my rank. "We need to talk." The conversation that followed was unlike anything in our family's history. My father, who had never apologized for anything in his life, stood in his own backyard and said words I'd never expected to hear. "We were wrong. About everything. About you." My mother joined us, her eyes red from crying. "We don't understand why you didn't tell us. Why you let us think." "Because you never asked," I said, and the simplicity of it hit them like a physical blow. "In 8 months, none of you ever asked what I did in the military. You just assumed I'd failed and moved on. But you live in our basement, my father said weakly, as if that somehow invalidated everything they'd just learned. I live in your basement because I'm recovering from 8 years of operations you'll never be cleared to know about. Because the military psychologist thought being around family would help me remember who I was before I became a weapon. The word hung in the air, weapon, and I saw them both flinch. The job ultimatum, my mother whispered. We gave you 60 days to find work or move out. I remember. But you don't need, you're still. I'm still active duty, I confirmed. On medical leave with full pay and benefits. I never needed your financial support. I was here because I wanted to be close to family while I healed. My father's face crumpled. We tried to throw you out. Yes, I said simply. You did. The weeks following the barbecue revealed felt like watching our family learn to walk again. Everything we thought we knew about each other had been shattered, and we were all struggling to figure out how to rebuild from the pieces. My parents' attempts at reconciliation were clumsy but sincere. My mother started leaving military history books on my nightstand, biographies of female generals, accounts of special operations missions. She'd clearly been researching, trying to understand a world she'd never bothered to explore before. My father took a different approach. One morning I found him in the garage, carefully mounting my deployment medals in a display case he'd built himself. When I asked him about it, he couldn't meet my eyes. I thought, he said quietly, maybe you'd want them somewhere people could see them. If that's okay with you. The case now hangs in their living room, right next to Marcus's Marine Corps photos. It was a small gesture, but it meant everything. Marcus struggled the most with the revelation. He'd built his entire identity around being the family's military success story, and learning that his failure sister outranked him by several pay grades had shaken him to his core. I used to brag about you being a disappointment, he confessed one evening as we sat on the back porch. At the base, with the guys. I'd tell them how my sister couldn't hack it in the military, how she came home with nothing to show for it. I know. Rodriguez says half the Marines on base have been laughing at me for months. They know who you are, Rebecca. They've known this whole time. The pain in his voice was genuine, and I found myself in the strange position of comforting the brother who'd spent 8 months treating me like a charity case. Marcus, I said carefully, your service matters. What you do matters. This isn't a competition. Isn't it, though? He looked at me with something that might have been admiration mixed with resentment. You're special operations. I'm regular infantry. You're a commander. I'm a staff sergeant. You've done things I'll never be cleared to know about, and I spent months thinking I was better than you. The conversation we needed to have was years overdue, but it finally happened that night. I told him what I could about my service, the parts that weren't classified, the missions I could acknowledge, the training that had shaped me into someone he'd never really known. In return, he told me about his own struggles with military life, about feeling like he had to live up to an impossible standard, about the pressure of being the family's golden child when he'd never felt particularly golden. I joined the Marines because you did, he admitted. I thought if I could be the son Dad wanted, maybe it would make up for you being the daughter he was disappointed in. And now I realize Dad was disappointed in the wrong kid. The hardest part of rebuilding wasn't the conversations. It was learning to live with the truth we'd all been avoiding. My parents had to confront the fact that their judgment had been so wrong, it bordered on cruelty. Marcus had to accept that his sister had been carrying secrets that dwarfed his own achievements. And I had to figure out how to be Rebecca Chen the daughter, while still being Commander Chen the soldier. Colonel Martinez called 3 weeks after the barbecue to check on my progress. How's the family adjustment going? She asked. Complicated, I said, but honest, finally. Good. Because I have news. Your medical leave has been extended another 6 months, but with a change in status. You're being transferred to the Veterans Affairs Liaison Program, helping other Special Operations veterans transition back to civilian life. The assignment was perfect. Meaningful work that used my experience while allowing me to stay close to family as we all learn to navigate this new reality. There's one more thing, Martinez added. Your security clearance review came back. No issues. Your cover situation with your family has been resolved to everyone's satisfaction. That evening, I found my mother in the kitchen, preparing dinner with the same methodical precision she'd always brought to the task. But something was different. She looked up when I entered, really looked at me, as if she was seeing me for the first time. 2 years later, I stand in the same VA office where I first started working with transitioning veterans, but everything has changed. The job that began as an extension of my medical leave has become my calling, helping special operations veterans navigate the invisible wounds that come with serving in shadows. My first client was a Navy SEAL who'd spent 3 years pretending to be a failed college dropout while living with PTSD from operations he couldn't discuss. Sound familiar? His family had written him off as lazy and directionless, never suspecting that their disappointment had single-handedly prevented 2 terrorist attacks on American soil. "How do you tell people who you really are?" he asked during our first session, "when you can't tell them what you've done?" I looked at him across the desk, remembering my own basement bedroom and the weight of my family's disappointment. You start by telling them that their assumptions are wrong. Then you show them who you've always been. It worked for him. It's worked for dozens of veterans since then. The process is always different, but the pattern is the same. Families who've written off their heroes, heroes who've forgotten their own worth, and the slow, difficult work of rebuilding trust on a foundation of truth. Marcus visits my office sometimes, usually when his unit has a veteran struggling with family relationships. He's become an unofficial advocate for military families, speaking at base events about the importance of asking the right questions and not making assumptions about service members' experiences. "I tell them about my sister," he said during his last visit. "About how I spent 8 months thinking she was a failure, while she was actually one of the most decorated officers in special operations. It's a wake-up call most families need to hear." The relationship between Marcus and me has evolved into something neither of us expected: genuine friendship. He's no longer the golden child carrying the weight of family expectations, and I'm no longer the disappointment hiding in plain sight. We're just siblings who finally know each other. Publications. My parents have become unlikely advocates themselves. My mother volunteers with military family support groups, sharing her story about the daughter I didn't know I had. My father speaks at veteran job fairs, helping employers understand that military service, especially classified service, doesn't always translate neatly to civilian resumes. "We were so focused on supporting the son who was easy to understand," my mother told a group of military spouses last month, "that we missed the daughter who needed us most." The hardest case I've handled was a female Army Ranger, whose family had disowned her entirely after she returned from deployment different. Different, in their minds, meant broken. In reality, it meant she'd spent 18 months as a liaison officer, coordinating counterterrorism operations across 3 continents, while everyone assumed she was a supply clerk. Her reunion with her family last spring was the first time I cried at work. Watching her father's face when he finally understood what his daughter had sacrificed for her country, and what he'd almost thrown away through ignorance, reminded me why this work matters. Colonel Martinez retired last year, but she still calls to check on my progress. "You know," she said during our last conversation, "when I recommended you for this position, I thought you'd help maybe a dozen veterans reconnect with their families. You've helped hundreds." "It's not just about the veterans," I told her. "It's about the families learning to see their heroes clearly." Today, a new client is coming in, a former Green Beret whose parents think he's been working construction for the past 6 years. His real job? Training allied forces in Afghanistan and providing security for diplomatic missions in hostile territory. His intake form lists his family's biggest concern: lack of ambition and career direction. I smile as I prepare for our session. Some stories never get old. My name is Rebecca Chen. I'm Commander Chen. And every day, I help families discover the heroes they never knew they had. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.